Okay, so thank you for attending this evening or this morning's webinar according to your location. So today is the part one of the Asia-US cross-border clinical trial regulatory compliance webinar. So we are focused on Korea-US side, and then we have three speakers, including me. So we have Ari is a principal consultant in Aspix Consulting Group, and Hayoung Lucy Jung is a manager in U.S. clinical operation team in CNL Research. It's a first CRA in South Korea. And then we have another speaker in the tomorrow, but he joined today, Stephen. So let me see that whether I can changing to full slide more. Anyway, okay, so today we are going to talk about that I will start in introduction and then the strategy for Korea-US cross-border clinical trial and regulatory compliance by RE. And also we are going to follow up by highlighting the Korea-US cross-border clinical trials as Korea's first CRO, Hayoung, and I'm going to talk about agentic AI framework. We have about 10 minutes in Q&A. So tomorrow is actually that we're going to have an Indian focus. So if you have time, then you can join tomorrow morning. Okay. So first, let me check that why this spot. Okay. So I can start. Okay, so let's just briefly go over that what is global transformation of clinical research and compliance. So now it's a trend that clinical research become multi-regional. So shift from country-specific trial to about the, let's see, focus. So it shifted from the country-specific to global multi-regional clinical trials. So the sponsors increasingly design trials that simultaneously run patient across US, Europe, and Asia. So why this? So what drives? So patient diversity and faster development and cost efficacy. So access to broader population improve generalizability and accelerate enrollment and reduce per patient cost. So regulatory side, the regulatory harmonization is ongoing, but still fragmented. So International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirement of Pharmaceutical for Human Use is one example. So it is a global body that develop unified technical and scientific guidelines for regulators. So all different jurisdiction regulator, FDA, MFDS, like in South Korea and other. So ICH provide a shared standard, but it operation execution vary by country. So even when regulators follow the same guidelines and differences in ethnic and review timeline, submission format, and data privacy laws create friction. So cross-border trial is kind of like central to global drug and medical device development. So US, Asia, EU integration is now the dominant model for pivotal studies. So foreign data acceptance policies, for example, in the 21 CFR 312120, it enable simultaneous approvals. So in theoretically, the global is kind of like the compliance and trials are now possible, but there are many challenges that we need to overcome. So Asia is a rising law accelerating in development cycles. So, for example, faster enrollment is in Korea and India, and complementing scientific and regulatory rigor in US, EU. So, Hayoung will and then Ari will discuss more detail, but it's generally that the Korea's strategic position in global trial compliance is ever increasing importance. So, bring high quality data recognized by global regulators is one reason, and fast, predictable regulatory timeline, and robust infrastructure for global trials, and proven track record of FDA EMA approvals. So I'm going to share this presentation and other speakers' presentation after the webinar. So you will look at detail later. And India we will talk about tomorrow. And so we will I'll stop here. So we will start that for deep dive into the topics. The first, Yuri, are you going to talk about the strategy?
Yes, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, thank you. Good, Alex, there. Can you see my screen correctly? Just want to verify before I go too far.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So first of all, thank you very much, Alex, for the introduction. And today we're going to talk about a little bit regarding clinical cross-border trials, looking at it from a strategic standpoint, from an overview standpoint, how the strategy for regulatory interface and interact with clinical trials strategy, specifically for Korean firms and Korean medtech innovators. Before we go too far, a little bit about myself and the firm, my firm. So my name is Aaron. I'm the founder and principal consultant of Apsus Consulting Group. We are a small boutique firm with scientists and engineers and doctors, as well as former FDA regulators. We focus specifically in the startup world with medtech and devices. You'll hear a little bit about medtech and pharmaceuticals within this webinar, but my focus will be more so on the device field versus my colleague Hayoung will be focusing more in the pharmaceutical realm. A little bit, so the central question that we want to answer now is why U.S. readiness now for Korean AI and medtech is an important topic to consider. As colleague Alex alluded to, Korea has fast-pacing, rapid development in the R&D, and that has been happening for some time now. Some of the positive aspects that, from a global strategic standpoint, we can see is not only does Korea have fast enrollment, rapid patient recruitment abilities, some great tertiary centers with specialized care, as well as extremely innovative and technological advancements in the medtech area. So all of these are strengths that Korean firms are definitely drawing on. But what we're going to see and what the data shows is that there's some delay in the conversion of some of that Korean firm innovation and converting that to U.S. device cleared devices within the U.S. FDA. And that's the focus of this discussion here. There's fewer FDA clearances, narrow therapeutic spread, and potentially some missed opportunities. So why? Well, what we're going to consider, or the three basic questions that we're going to consider today are, first of all, why do we need to evaluate U.S. readiness at an early strategic point? Why should Korean firms do this at an early strategic point? Two, what has prevented some Korean firms and some Korean technology from reaching the U.S. FDA? And what can we do about that? And thirdly, how can Korean clinical studies be designed in such a way that they satisfy both the MFDS regulatory requirements and the US FDA regulatory requirements? What are some nuances? And regarding that, we have worked in the past couple of years with some great Korean firms and have noted a trend in terms of opportunities for improvement within the cross-border clinical trial framework. So how are we going to answer those questions? Well, we're going to provide first a little bit of context, framing what does U.S. readiness mean from a regulatory strategic standpoint. What does the current regulatory intelligence show us? What does the data provide, and what gleanings can we capture from that data? And how does the difference in mindset from the regulatory bodies in Korea and the US require us to think differently when we're early in the design development process so that we are able to execute effectively in both regulatory bodies? Obviously, for those firms looking for a global strategic standpoint, a lot of the same principles will apply. But given my firm's expertise in the US FDA area, that's what we'll be mostly discussing. So then we'll look at a couple of case studies where we look at how have the non-clinical pitfalls of predecessors, how do they inform us in terms of being more strategic as we move forward? And what are some of the requirements from a clinical standpoint that the US FDA will be looking for in not only your Korean clinical studies, but your general clinical strategic operations? We'll be looking at that and addressing those three questions. First of all, a little bit of looking at things from a larger vantage point. So we can see two work streams here. No need to get so much in the details, but the top work stream, regulatory and evidence strategy, shows us through what a typical workflow would look like when you're defining your regulatory strategy. You have to understand FDA classification, your pathway, your clinical endpoints. What does your evidence package look like from a non-clinical and a clinical perspective? And all of those key decisions that you make at each one of these junctures feeds into your Korean trial execution operations. My colleague Ha-Young will be discussing in more detail some of the from an operational standpoint what that looks like. But we're going to stay in that top work stream. How do we design that work stream effectively so that they can communicate effectively with your clinical trials that you have planned? And how do you design those clinical trials in a way that you can utilize them not only for MFDS regulatory requirements, but US FDA regulatory requirements? So let's set the stage a little bit, and let's see what the data and the regulatory intelligence tells us. First and foremost, as we said, Korea is a hotbed for research and development, high technology, and advanced clinical trials operations. Some of the data points here: 600 to 700 new trials every year. A huge advancements in oncology, total research volume, with a large concentration in Seoul, the capital, of course. So what we see is great infrastructure, a lot of growth, fantastic focus areas. That's fantastic. What are some additional data points that we can draw from? Well, if you look at from all available open resources, public resources, there's approximately 900 open clinical trials in Korea, active research being done today. But if we look at the concentration of what those trials are, we can see that they are typically only focused in Korea only. They're being performed at about a 93% rate just in Korea versus a multi-country approach, and a heavy domestic focus in those clinical trials. And that bottom quadrant shows us that a good majority of these trials are being conducted at a single site. Why are these things important? Well, we're going to see later on how the FDA looks at clinical trials that are from a single site and with a limited cultural diversity as compared to the US population. And we'll see that some of the pitfalls that arise from trying to translate those clinical endpoints and clinical conclusions come from this specific data set. that clinical trials are very local. If they're very localized, they can encounter some issues when you're trying to put together a US-based submission, or in general, a global approach, a global submission. So we'll talk about what that means and how we can mitigate some of those obstacles that arise from this. So huge innovation, a lot of clinical trials, but how does that translate into actual cleared devices with the US FDA? I know some of the attendants here are looking at their US FDA strategy moving forward, and even device strategy from a global perspective, and how do you move into other markets? That's a very important question. We can see here from a total of 3,000 device clearances just this year alone in 2025, only 24 of those came from Korean sponsors, Korean firms. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the level and the amount of research that's being done to the actual clearances in medical devices themselves. 9 unique companies in particular, and you can see the focus groups there, radiology and dental being the highest clearances. So how do we more diversify this data? Here's a couple of examples of some of the companies that have been recently cleared. Huge advances in innovation and huge implementations of AI and diagnostic technologies. So before we go into how to overcome those obstacles, it's important to understand a little bit more about the US FDA framework and how that translates from a Korean regulatory framework to a US regulatory framework. So I'll discuss very briefly some of the general principles in the US FDA that you need to be aware of as a founder or innovator in a Korean firm. First of all, we understand the structure of the FDA's organization. There's different centers, one for drug, one for biologic, one for devices. The majority of our work at Apsys Consulting Group refers to devices and radiological health, so I'll talk about that a little bit more. And within each of these groups, there's different offices that review products based on their therapeutic approach. Furthermore, the risk classification, similar to MFDS, is based on the potential risk to the patient. Class 1 being the lowest risk, Class 3 being the highest risk. Each of these risk categories carry a different level of evidentiary burden from a regulatory standpoint. And the way you conduct clinical trials for each of these, while similar, you have to consider the level of scrutiny that you'll receive from the FDA depending on the risk classification of your device. Also, you'll have to consider the different requirements from a statistical standpoint. You'll need more data, very clear and fine clinical endpoints depending on the risk classification of your device. So that's one of the first decisions you have to make is what is the device going to look like? And where do we fall in the risk category? That will decide what your non-clinical and clinical evidence burdens are moving down the line. And it's not a one-to-one from MFDS to US FDA. So how is that done? So prior to clearing or approving a device, FDA makes a decision, or you propose a decision on risk category, and then you take a look at the existing body of medical devices and see if there's a predicate that mimics your intended use and your technology. If there is, and you can be considered substantially equivalent, the 510(k) pathway tends to be the easiest pathway for you to move forward with. But let's say your technology is different in such a way that it introduces different questions of safety and efficacy. Well, typically then you have to make a decision to go a different path. And the de novo is the most common path for low to moderate risk devices. What that means is that you're establishing a new category of device within the FDA's classification structure. That gives you some opportunities from a business perspective to be the first of its kind in the US. And also there's some reimbursement applications associated with de novo devices. But if you're a very high risk or a high risk device, such as implants, neurological devices, oncological devices, typically you end up in a PMA pathway, which is the highest risk pathway. Each of these pathways have different levels of evidence burden that you have to provide as a sponsor to the FDA. So key decisions in which pathway you arrive at result in different level of burden from an evidence standpoint, different types of clinical trials that you can do, and the amount of patients that need to be enrolled, if it's a prospective clinical trial, or how much data you need if it's a retrospective clinical trial. So these are key decisions. So how does that factor in? Or why are we talking about this? Well, that helps you understand why the MFDS dossier, or the technical file, sometimes has gaps when you evaluate them with the US FDA expectations. The risk framework is a little bit different. The evidence burden is different depending on the classification of your device, the risk of your device. And all of this results in what we found are some key structural gaps in the MFDS technical file that need to be filled if you're looking to move into the US. What are some of those gaps? Well, software architecture, software documentation tends to be a gap that we've seen multiple times. Cybersecurity, the FDA has greatly increased the requirements that are around cybersecurity, where many CE marked or approved devices in other countries have to do some significant remediation from a architecture standpoint for some softwares, but definitely from a documentation standpoint as well. Usability is something that the FDA needs to see in a very specific way or form with the US population and US clinicians. And then the clinical study itself. What data do you have, and what will the FDA accept? These tend to be gaps that we've seen when translating from a MFDS dossier to the US FDA expectations. If you're interested in looking at an overall gap analysis, feel free to drop your name in the chat. We can provide you with a template for analyzing those gaps, some of the typical gaps that we've seen: software, cybersecurity, biocompatibility, usability, labeling. And we're happy to provide that for you if you'd like to do that analysis yourself. But the key point is, don't assume that because you're cleared in Korea or anywhere else internationally, automatically all the requirements are met from a US FDA standpoint. Unfortunately, the US FDA does have some very unique and clinical and strict requirements with some of these topics. And it's important to do that gap analysis. And then have a remediation plan. So you'll have the slides so you can review these in detail, and happy to provide you with a template so you can perform that gap analysis. So what are some non-clinical gaps that we've seen? Here's one particular use case that we can talk about, and we can see why it's important or imperative to do this analysis as early in development as you have a good idea of what your final fit, form, and function of the device will be, what your indications and intended use will be. As soon as you understand that, it's important to do this type of analysis. One particular client, oncology imaging software as a medical device based out of Seoul, detected lesions using radiological data, was applying for 510(k) clearance. The founder believed, and the regulatory team believed, that they had more than enough evidence, data, a full dossier to fulfill the FDA requirements. Well, we did this gap analysis, looked at their cybersecurity documents. We found significant gaps in their cybersecurity requirements according to the according to the FDA standards. There were some missing software functions, software documentation. Just in software and cybersecurity alone, for example, there's 24 different documents that the FDA requests just to assess and see if you've met all of the requirements. So don't assume that you've met all of them unless you perform the gap analysis. You may well might have, but in this particular case, they performed that gap analysis very late in their planning, and that resulted in a lot of remediation, redocumentation, new cyber risks that needed to be managed, changes to the architecture that resulted in a 6 to 9 month delay, just because this type of analysis wasn't done earlier. So this is a good case study of planning early. So we've talked a little bit about non-clinical. Let's talk about clinical. For making sure that your clinical trials are set up effectively, one of the most important exercises that we recommend our clients to do is a systematic endpoint mapping exercise. This means mapping all of your marketing claims, performance claims, the intended use and indications, and mapping those specifically to your primary endpoints within a clinical study. And then making sure that you have the right comparators. FDA requires many of the tests to be done to a gold standard or a current standard of care within the US. If that standard of care or if that gold standard is different in Korea or in another part of the world where you've conducted your clinical study, it's unlikely that the FDA will accept that trial in a submission. So understanding what are your comparators, what does the US require, what does the FDA require for your comparators to be? Do they require a biopsy? Do they require a comparative analysis to a predicate? Will they accept that? Will they accept intermediary or a different test that is emerging? For example, recently had a client working in the hepatology sphere who wanted to use TE or a non-invasive test as the gold standard, and FDA did not okay that. They needed to have an invasive test be performed as the gold standard. So these are the questions you need to do to map your endpoints to your claims and make sure you're developing the right evidence to be able to utilize in an FDA submission. What's an example of these? Well, there's some vague marketing phrases that we've seen. For example, detects lung cancer early. Why is that a difficult endpoint? It's not a clinical adjudication. It's not a clinical endpoint that you can claim, that you can validate. So in this particular case, we refine that to identifies and highlights suspected pulmonary nodules on chest CT to assist radiologists. It's a more precise regulatory claim. Acts as a virtual doctor. Again, very vague marketing phrase. We had to change that one to provides reference information based on clinical guidelines to support physician decision making. Understanding the language that the FDA wants you to use is important when you're submitting IFUs, marketing materials as a part of your submission. And having somebody that understands the FDA language is imperative to make sure you don't have issues during your submission, specifically related to this. So let's talk a little bit now more in depth on clinical trials. What data, what does the FDA look for in outside of US data? Does that mean that you can't use outside of US data? No, you can. In many cases, the FDA will require you to use at least 50% of your data within the US. That means 50% of your data, or 49% of your data, can come from elsewhere. But you have to make sure that they have the correct good clinical practice protocols in place, that your population applies and is representative of the US population, of the US intended use population, and that your practice of medicine and standard of care also compare. Those are the three critical pillars that the FDA looks at. What are some common gaps in the clinical data set? If you use only Korean from a single Korean data from a single site, you won't be able to generalize that typically, to the US population. The practice of medicine may be different. So you have to validate that your standard of care and your endpoints are the same. So we've seen that missing in some of the data sets. So in general, you need to design your data points, your data collection standards, your statistical plan. All of these decisions need to be made early so that when you conduct your clinical study, you've aligned them to the FDA's best practice. And if you do that early, in many instances, we've seen that you don't have to make extensive changes to the data, but just critical ones so that you make sure and capture the correct data in the correct manner from the correct population with the correct endpoints. And that leads to successful submissions. So what is the summary? Why is US readiness critical? Well, world-class research and development within Korea, but some of the obstacles we presented result in disadvantages to firms that don't consider the US FDA standpoint early on. What has effectively prevented Korean devices from reaching the US? We've seen some deficiencies from a non-clinical standpoint, cybersecurity, software, and from a clinical standpoint, population, data capture, standard of care. How can the clinical studies you design and execute in Korea satisfy both MFDS and FDA requirements? You have to make sure that the critical components of that study are aligned to FDA best practices. If you do that, you can not only save money, do your studies effectively, but also not have to repeat them. So in general, if that's something that you're interested in, we're happy to have a discussion and look at your particular plans for clinical studies and your regulatory strategy and see if it can't be better aligned with US FDA expectations. So thank you very much. With that, I'll pass it back to Alex.
Thank you, Yuri. Yeah, anyone have any special question to Yuri? You can keep going on, interact with Yuri using chat, and then we'll have a separate Q&A session at the end. Okay. Okay, so Hayoung, could you share your slide and start?
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let me share my screen first. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for joining. I'm Hayoung, and I'm working for CNR Research US Clinical Operation Team in Boston. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or need anything from CNR Research. I will get us started. So I will begin with introducing my team first and talk about why Korea is great for clinical trials, and finally some strategies for between Korea, US cross-border clinical trials. So CNR Research is founded in 1997 as the first CRO established in South Korea, Seoul. So our headquarters is located in Seoul with additional office at Busan. And we've expanded our presence with offices in US and Thailand recently. And we have over 500 employees. So how much do you know about clinical trial industry in Korea? Korea ranks the top 10 countries worldwide in the total number of clinical trials and Asia's second most active country for multinational clinical trials. This strong performance is supported by a well-established national infrastructure. For example, more than 200 medical institutions are designated by the MFDS, meaning the agency formally regulates and oversees site qualifications. In addition, the entire population is covered by national health insurance, which significantly enhances patients' access to hospitals and study participation. So in spite of this high trial volume, there have been no critical findings from FDA inspections in Korea. So I'm going to talk about 4 advantages why Korea can be a strong fit for the clinical trials. First of all, Korean population is slightly over 50 million, and more than half of the population is concentrated in the Seoul metropolitan area. You can see the red box here. So since only MFDS designated sites are authorized to conduct trials, about 25 million people are effectively served by just 109 designated sites. This results in a high potential pool of clinical trial subjects per site. As I mentioned before, the entire population is covered by the National Health Insurance, which enable patients to access hospitals easily and consistently. Together, these factors contribute to strong patient availability at clinical trial sites. Secondly, I'd like to focus on the high patient pool, which can make faster enrollment. I'm not suggesting that Korea can provide larger patient number for every indication. However, for major types of cancer, Korea shows higher or similar prevalence compared to states. So when you consider the country's high population density, along with the government's strict designation requirements for clinical sites, the actual patient availability at each site is higher than what is reflected by prevalence figures alone. And moving on to cost effectiveness, over the past 15 years, Korea's clinical trial industry has grown rapidly. Although costs have also increased during this period, Korea still remains highly competitive in terms of budget. For easier comparison, I'm showing the cost of phase 1 first in human healthy volunteer study, as you know, which is relatively standardized. Please note that these figures shown here are provided by CNR and the Clinical Pharmacology Department at Seoul National University. For the study design, consisting of 5 SAD cohorts and 4 MAD cohorts with 72 subjects, the overall cost does not exceed $2 million. For phase 2 studies, the general range is approximately $3 to $5 million, and for phase 3 studies, roughly $10 to $15 million. If you'd like more detailed cost information, please feel free to contact me separately. Finally, for the startup timeline, from the package preparation to the site activation, it takes about 4 to 5 months, which is very quicker than other countries. Our regulatory requirements are relatively strict. However, the MFDS follows ICH standards, and MFDS approval is widely recognized as a strong indication of the investigational product quality and efficacy. It became an attractive advantage when pursuing license-out opportunities. In addition, the turnaround time for budget and contract negotiations in Korea is notably shorter too. And moving on to the next, I'd like to share some strategy for Korea-US cross-border clinical trials. For phase 1 study, healthy volunteer studies conducted in South Korea, we typically include 1 Caucasian cohort. This allows for an ethnic sensitivity assessment, and the PK data generated from this design is acceptable to the FDA. As a result, no additional PK study is required for the US population when entering a FDA pivotal trial. In addition, Korea has ICH GCP compliant phase 1 units with an environment that is fully inspection ready for the FDA. So local CROs also maintain strong working relationship with the MFDS, which contributes to shorter approval timelines. Overall, conducting phase 1 in Korea with the addition of 1 Caucasian cohort provides FDA compatible, faster, and cost-effective approach, typically 30% to 50% lower in cost compared to US. How can we prepare the next phase 2 study? The answer is it's better to open sites in US and Korea because it ensures global regulatory alignment and early US patient exposure, which can support FDA expectations. And for enrollment ratio, 70% of Korea and 30% of US could be ideal to optimize cost efficiency while maintaining US patient data, since Korea's fast enrollment can offset US delays. Regarding to choosing CRO, it's better to cover both regions with one CRO to ensure operational consistency with single system, consistent monitoring, and streamlined communication. And how about pivotal study then? Actually, it depends on therapeutic area and indication. So if the indication is higher in certain countries or ethnic groups, working with same local CRO, including US sites, is generally less cost and time efficient. However, if recruitment is challenging or if there is no particular country with significantly higher disease prevalence and the budget it allows, then partnering with a global CRO with extensive branch offices is more appropriate approach. Finally, this is the last slide, and you can see the key reasons to choose Sienna Research in South Korea. So fast turnaround timeline, cost effectiveness, high quality infrastructure, and global experience can make Korea can be a global clinical trial sites. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you,
And
Aya. Yeah,
thank you.
excellent presentation and clearly showed the very, very strategically strong like value proposition in the cross-border, especially you choose South Korea as a first phase trial, right? So I can see that. Okay, so someone had any kind of question to Hayoung, you can keep going on in chat, and then we can have a separate Q&A after my talk. My talk will be very short. So I will show my slide again. Okay. So can you see my agentic AI framework? Okay. Okay. I'm not going to show the detail about agentic AI framework, but I will already share my white paper to describe detail about it. So I will briefly talk about why I'm talking about this. Okay, for example, that there are many kind of like the overcoming the challenges that we have encounter in cross-border like clinical trial and compliance. So, for example, that the all talk about today by both speakers, they are expert, right? Usually they're working through their expertise and experience, right? But in a complex situation like these clinical trials and FDA clear like compliance, that we need more like some supporting tool that the human coordination is overwhelmed. So, for example, there is an increasing complexity. Also, like the if you want to like the both side, for example, even just look at the South Korea and United States, and then there is a different type of regulatory compliance password and clinical trial, all different, right? So if you want to be like a unified view, then in other than just like a manual, like a human brain expertise, you need something to be more smart way to look at it. And also like the huge amount of data involved, right? Through the clinical trial and FDA clearance, like the AI, especially agentic AI, is very good at looking at the right data and then gathering data, gather insight, right? And orchestrating data layer. So that's why that in many aspects that agentic AI can have, like I cannot show you today, in a short way, but anyway. So so there are many kind of like things that you can get the support from agentic AI. So the why that even if you have a different type of AI, the why agentic AI, they are very very like next evolution of AI. So they can be six core functions that perceive, reason, remember, use, to act, govern is very similar like reasoning and human-like mental thought, something like that. So that's why that AI can be your co-filer. So what usually I'm doing is to developing agentic AI co-filer to use. So usually I term like the agentic AI twin of you. So usually, for example, that in this framework, they can be the like a co-filer to the Ari's kind of expertise, Hayoung's expertise they follow and that they support. So usually I have a intensive experience developing this kind of agentic AI for different kind of like the in healthcare and life science applications. So, for example, that one example, in our context, like they can work for global input and contextualization layer. So, and then protocol harmonization and compliance design layer, and regulatory ethnic coding layer, and data integrated audit layer, and practical regulatory intelligence layer, human oversight, and continuous learning layer. They can be integrate all different type of like agentic AI layer to support in all aspects of the workflow pathway in cross-border clinical trial and then the regulatory compliance. So one example is that they can support like operational synchronization, so multi-CRO alignment, automated communication streams, and regulatory harmonization. So they can looking at the unified compliance ontology across FDA, EMA, FDS, and other. And then also like ethnic governance automation, so standardized packet and synchronized amendment propagation, and data integrity and privacy enforcement, and predictable breathing and scientific consistency. So if you are interested in this topic, actually, I have a bunch of the previous webinar actually the addressed how to agentic AI can framework to supporting in the healthcare and life science ecosystem. So kind of like collaboration, partnership, even fundraising and individual innovation. So you can look at my the posting or my kind of like a previous webinar recording in my YouTube site. Okay, thank you. Okay, so so we have about 12 minutes. So we have enough time to have any further like a discussion or the Q&A or comment. So anyone like Ari or the Hyung, do you wanna share anything more? Like because of time limitation, then you can talk about.
Do you have anything to talk about it, Ari?
Um, uh, no, not necessarily. I'll defer to you first if you don't if you have something.
I think um like after COVID, especially like pharmaceutical industry in US and Korea was not a fun time, but hopefully it will get better soon. And like Korean president is changed and he investigates he invests a lot of like funding in R&D especially. So I think it's very good timing to do clinical trial in Korea, either US.
Mhm.
spectacular.
How about like I think that the Edie already mentioned that there are two big category like that I'm just categorize the healthcare and life science, and then for as a product we have two different type of the product. One is a medical device and the other pharma bio product, right? The usual drug, right?
Yes.
So in that aspect, okay, the which are the advantage, like for example, the cross-border kind of like a strategic advantage, the which side, medical device or the pharma kind of, because as far as I know that South Korea actually their main industry is not healthcare or the life science, right? Because the mostly the strong kind of like the innovator and also like industry leader is, as you know, Samsung, LG, and Hyundai.
Hmm.
It's automotive and consumer electronics, semiconductor, something like that, right? So we don't have any kind of leading industry like a global level Fortune 500 kind of company in even
Hmm.
in the like pharmaceutical or in the medical device company, right?
Hmm.
But I believe that South Korea is very innovative. So I think that we may have some strategic point, and even if we have like in a industry wise, the South Korea is not strong driver in a pharma in medical device, but actually that there will be in the strategically, and we can leverage in other the innovate environment in South Korea to
Yeah.
for this kind of like a cross-border trials and compliance. So can you share your insight about that?
Yeah, sure. In the past year or so, I've met with many founders, specifically in South Korea, and I've seen some fantastic innovation from a med tech perspective, and from a pharmaceutical. Even though I'm not my firm isn't focused on pharmaceutical, it is more focused on the device field. LSL 7.1, many others similarly that are making great strides from a technological AI implementation of for different therapies and diagnostics. So I think the field is growing, and we've definitely received more inquiries from South Korean companies. And some of the players or large players, for example, the nine company sponsors that had clearances, Samsung, for example, still has some clearances in the medtech field. So I think it's definitely growing and growing, and the, that's why it's important to, and I stress the fact of that early strategic analysis to be able to ensure that the data that you're collecting in Korea, uh, fantastic data, can be used in the U.S. And more and more, at least on the device side, I know Hayung shared the 70-30 split from a pharmaceutical perspective, but on the device side, FDA is requiring at least 50% of the data to be representative of U.S. population. Uh, I have seen some instances where outside of the U.S. only data has been used to clear U.S. Devices in the U.S., but those are more few and far between. But I've definitely seen some great innovation in the medtech field utilizing AI and software specifically from South Korean firms. So definitely, I think it's growing.
Hmm. How about Hayam? Do you have anything to share?
So currently, CNR Research, US are making a partnership with local CRO in US too, and many Korean biotech company and pharmaceutical companies want to expand their businesses in US, and they want to submit some like FDA submission to, including medical device and either like investigational products. So definitely it will be growing, and I read some articles about as you mentioned, that it will be more like growing, more growing than like semiconductor thing or other industry that so pharmaceutical industry will be bigger than like Samsung Semiconductor or other things in US and Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Because actually I just choose a topic not in the South Korea in India. Actually, that because South Korea, for example, Samsung has a very strong footprint in India, right? So, and also like Stephen will share his insight. He's very expertise in Indian clinical trials, and then actually that I'm a strategy advisor Stephen's company about the developing agentic AI platform to make the easier the activation of the clinical trial using AI. But he was like a lot of the experience in Indian. But I also like me, I have a lot of contact, and then I invited this spring from India about to talk about agentic AI in healthcare. So, but I think that I'm just thinking of a triangle kind of like collaboration, India, South Korea, and US. Kind of, it will be very powerful. That's what I'm thinking about. So I just invite to Stephen talk about India, right? And then I invite to the Indian. I have a lot of the like a colleague here, that the friend in Harvard Medical and other in from India. So I know that they are very active in healthcare and biopharma area. So that will also we can continue discuss tomorrow, right? So that will be the exciting talk. And after we have a focus on South Korea today, and then we will talk about India, and then we can think about like how to we collaborate, like a three triangle, right? That'll be the exciting, right? And another thing that this is one thing that I'll share with you that I have a lot of connection in South Korea, mostly rather than biopharma, but mostly the device side, right? Because of the my activities in AI space and more tie into they call digital health, right? Well, recently I found that the one person actually I have a network in Samsung. The previously his title was a digital health, right? Recently changed to healthcare. So I think that the Samsung thinking about more broad engagement with the healthcare rather than just AI or the healthcare, just digital health, right? So I think that and also like another thing that I'm going to have a webinar about is that recently the pharma also changing, right? The reason is that recently I have a lot of discussion with the Boston area innovators, and then and also like from South Korea, and then to focusing that the pharma changes that they're looking at the quantum computing. 'Cause actually that they are very kind of like the side of the like a Samsung or big kind of like a giant company like Google, Apple is a major stream, right? But they're looking at the like a quantum computing. The other is that they're looking at the different type of AI. The recently I found that they call the casual AI is they because of the whatever you develop your cancer drug, whatever, like you don't know about the cause. For example, that you have something, have a molecular design, whatever, right? You cure it, but you don't know about the why they cure this, right? So AI, there is a casual AI actually that they can explain that why this molecular structure can cure some targeting cancer or something like that, right? So they're looking at the different view, like so traditional pharma company, right? Just the drug development, like a pathology will be different, right? Their pathway is different. So what I'm thinking about is convergence, right? It's a medical device, the pharma product we combine, right? It's converged. That's I'm thinking, right? That's why that this unified scheme of the clinical trial and the compliance will be ever more important, right? Because the unified view of the cross-border, also unified view of the industry, right? So that's inside I'm thinking about.
I, Absolutely. No, I agree completely.
Okay, so we'll see tomorrow, the 10 a.m. in Eastern time, and then that's a afternoon time in the India. But I invite many people from India also, so I hope they join, and then we'll enjoy a good time because Stephen is an exciting guy, so we have a good time. And then Young, if you have a time, you please join, and we can discuss later about like how we collaborate India, South Korea, and United States. Okay. Okay. So thank you for
Definitely.
attending this
Thank
evening
you.
and this morning's webinar. And then hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.